Powered by Go-Goat Sports in partnership with TSN. This is season 4. It is episode 23 of the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast, and it is presented by our title sponsor, Canadian Club Whiskey. We've got Chris Abbott from Botano who will stop by. I think Chris had a pretty good weekend in the NFL. We'll talk about the semifinals of the World Cup of Soccer coming up. I am in a hotel room in Palm Beach, Florida, Ray, for the Board of Governors meetings, which will...
I see you made your bed.
Yeah, I did actually made the bed. Meetings will wrap up today. Fairly uneventful. They'll get to some business stuff. Might feel a little bit eye glazing, so we're not going to spend too much time on that.
Dregs, are those things ever interesting?
Well, historically they have been, right? When you've got the big things like, expansions and notable events. Mm. But this one in December is usually pretty uneventful. It usually is. And, there's a handful of general managers here who are also governors or alternate governors.
Okay.
Joe Sakic's here, Doug Armstrong is here, Billy Guerin. I mean, Billy Guerin is always good to be around. I watched part of the Wild Oilers game with Billy last night.
I bet he's calm, eh?
You know what? It was a 2-1 finish in favor of the Wild, so he was in good spirits, and he was with his owner Craig Leopold, so maybe that kind of kept him in check. But had a near-death experience on Sunday here in Monday morning, early yesterday morning. I'm up early, right? Grab a coffee, just finished radio, so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go and get some exercise, go for a walk on the beach. Well, where we're staying, it's a little bit different, right? It's the breakers. So, the shore is a little bit different. And the waves, I don't know, the sea was angry yesterday, but it was beautiful. It was like 27 degrees Celsius. So I go down there. It's like 7:30 in the morning. I'm in my flip-flops, so the wave comes crashing in. It's about ankle depth, not that big of a deal. My phone pings. So I look down and I'm responding to a text or whatever, not paying attention to what is coming. And what is coming is a much larger wave that crashes into the shoreline and takes me off right at the hips. Like now I'm in shorts and a t-shirt, but and the sand was kind of muddy and I couldn't move. Like it almost dragged me into the ocean. I was like,
was anybody around?
No. And that was the first thing.
Bad.
That was the first thing. I'm checking around going, God, did anybody see this? So just to wrap up the story. So I survived. I got out of it. I was embarrassed, but I got out of it. I'm now cleaned up and waiting for the governors and the owners to go into the boardroom from the meeting. George McPhee walks by from the Vegas Golden Knights, and you would know this about George. He is super fit, right? Like it's almost like he's training for something. And at these events, he's always swimming in the ocean. So I said to him, because we see him out there all the time, excuse me. I said, George, you go for a swim today? And he goes, no, I was going to, but I went to the hotel and they said, no, you better stay out of the water today. It's not very nice out there and it's dangerous. And by the way, there's been a couple of sharks spotted. And he's like, I was okay with the waves and whatnot, but the sharks, I wasn't going out there with the sharks. So it's just you
would have been a nice nugget. You would have been a nice nugget for one of those sharks.
So anyway, that was my welcome back to Florida. So hopefully things calm down a little bit more later today and we'll get back out there. So speaking of sharks, let's chew through the headlines. Again, presented this year by our pals at Boston Pizza. Talked about Billy Guerin, and one of the things that I've gotten from the meetings here, Ray, especially from the general managers, is the parity that we see in the National Hockey League, right? Start of the year, we're looking at Arizona, Chicago, maybe Montreal, and saying, well, those are the teams that primarily are going to be in the running for Connor Bedard and the draft in June, just because of how poorly constructed these teams are by design. Yet here you see Arizona's winning some games. Montreal's probably better than they thought they would be. Chicago had the good start. Billy Guerin is like, how do you predict who's the Stanley Cup favorite? Aside from looking at the standings, I mean, we can all see who's at the top of the division, top of the NHL. And then you think of the defending Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche, and you're like, well, no Kadri, no Burakovsky. I mean, they're a different team now than what they were.
Sure.
and injury on top of all that. So let me ask you this. And then I'll get to the second part of this, because it was another conversation with the manager about how difficult it is to make trades in this environment. But is parity a good thing? It is from as far as Gary Bettman is concerned, it speaks to pure good health of the National Hockey League to have 31, 32 teams that are essentially in it as we push close to the 30 game mark. But do you see it that way, or do you like when you've got kind of runaway favorites?
It's great from the bottom of the league up, from a bottom to top. For sure, parity is good. You don't. Well, up to the end of my career, we're playing Pittsburgh. They've got their power play on the ice. Their power play made more money than our roster. We're looking at, those five guys. We actually were adding it up on the bench, and we're like, those five guys make more than our whole team. And how could that even be good for? We won 14 games. It's brutal. I do think parity is a good thing for the league health. The lack of movement among teams, though, I really think it's complicated, but I think there's a way to address it, and I do think that it should be at least considered.
Yeah.
Whether it's some kind of player exemption to the cap, because it is. I don't know who used this example. It was probably Brian Burke, but said the cap number is like a moth to a light. Like you set the cap and the moth gets right to the light.
Yeah.
And look at all the teams that have no room, teams that you wouldn't think would spend to the cap limit. Well, they are now.
Yeah.
And so part of that is that with the cap, of course, Dregs, as you well know, there is a floor. Like teams have to spend to the floor. So in the past, players that would be depth players on really good teams are now more expensive players on poor teams. And so those players are pretty decent players.
They are,
and they help float the boat of the poor teams. So I do think there should be a consideration of some exemption, because it would spring movement among the players, and it is without fail one of the two most popular days off the ice in the NHL are free agent frenzy and the trade deadline.
Absolutely.
And that's because there's player movement.
Yeah.
And as soon as you put the cork in player movement, it's boring. I look around, you follow team to team to team, and everybody's saying the same thing. It's not like one team saying, hey, I can't make a trade.
Right.
Every team is saying, I'd like to do something. I can't.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's good for the interest point of the game.
100% agree with that. And Guerin again made the point. Now, Billy Guerin cut his teeth in management with Jim Rutherford, right? With the Pittsburgh Penguins. So he learned a lot from Jimmy. And we know that, again, looking back over time as general manager, Jim Rutherford always got into that trade pool early. And he wasn't necessarily consumed with, well, am I going to win that trade? Of course, you go in, you make a deal, you hope that your team gets better. That's the essence of making the trade. But Jimmy's perspective was, well, if it doesn't work out, then I'll try and fix it again. And Billy says that's the most frustrating part for him, is that you try and engage, but unless the guy that you're dealing with is convinced he's winning the trade, he's not going to bother. He's going to wait until the deadline.
And Dregs, it's not even, I don't think it's because they want to win the trade because they want to win the trade.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really worried about the perception and the scrutiny that goes around every move.
Exactly right.
As you know, I'm a baseball fan. I'm watching the Red Sox right now, and I'm really having a tough time wondering what the hell they're doing, because all their best players have left over the last few years. But of course, in Canada, we see a lot of coverage of the Blue Jays. And so, I see the Blue Jays are sitting around. They're not doing anything. They're not, the pressure on those managers to shut out the noise must be immense.
Right.
Because, in the last 3 days, they picked up an outfielder and a pitcher.
Mm-hmm.
They've done their work. But in the meantime, that manager's taken it in the shins from his fan base, which, if there's enough noise, gets to the ownership. The ownership wonders what the hell's going on. It's a tough place to be.
Yeah.
And so I think they're They're worried about losing a trade. They're worried about inaction. They're worried that they're going to be perceived in a way that makes it look like they're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Yet, I've said this before, if the fans and the media are aware that a team needs a winger or a defenseman, you got to be pretty sure that the managers know too.
Fair enough.
They just can't make the damn deal, or else they would.
Yeah. Well, speaking of potential trade, and Jim Rutherford, Patrick Galvin of the Vancouver Canucks, as has been reported, Bo Horvat recently declined the latest contract extension offer by the Vancouver Canucks, and that's probably 10 days, 2 weeks ago. The Canucks now, without question, are motivated to trade Bo Horvat. Would you do it sooner rather than later? And I guess, based on everything we've just talked about, you've got to have a trade partner. So when the deal makes sense, when the fit is right, then you execute the trade. But you're talking about a pretty important piece here in Vancouver.
You do. So you can't, I mean, they could make a trade tomorrow, I'm sure, and it wouldn't be a very good one. And so they're trying to wait to balance their part of leverage with another team's need. When I look at Horvat, you know, I'm looking in the media here in Vancouver, the way they, you know, the intensity around Bo Horvat and his fabulous start to the year, but he starts to get covered like he's a 50 goal scorer because that's the pace he's on. Yeah. But he's not. You have to look. So one side's looking at it like, hey, the Canucks are looking at it like, look at the season he's having. That's the return we need. Yeah. And the other team is saying, yeah, historically he's whatever the number of goals is per year. Mm-hmm. And Horvat's, you know, I think he takes more faceoffs than anybody in the league. He's had, you know, he's right at 20 goals. He's had an amazing start. Yeah. And so if you're going to move him, you need a return. Here's the complication. For the teams that will need a centerman, a prominent centerman, those teams have to identify where they are during the season, right? Where they are, what do they think their long-term perspective is for this year? Here's the other part. I was in St. Louis the other night. Ryan O'Reilly's without a contract. Yeah. Jonathan Toews has had a pretty good start to the season in Chicago. Yeah. Most certainly is going to be moved. So there's 3 centermen. Mm-hmm. So if I'm Team A, I'm bouncing phone calls off these 3 guys, figuring out who can I get the most return of production from for the least. Yeah. And I'm not talking about a 7-year contract. I'm talking about this year. Yeah. Because they're all coming out of contract.
So you're playing the rental game. You're not looking at, well, I guess potentially you could look at an extension.
Sure, you could, but that's certainly going to change the dynamic of what you're doing. You're going to have to wait until that player shows up in your city to get that extension done. And so the complication is it's not just in this market, you know, like a team's market. If Doug Armstrong decides to pull the pin in St. Louis and say, you know what, we're not going to be a team that can go on a 2-month run in St. Louis. We need to move Tarasenko. We need to move need to move O'Reilly. Yeah. Because those guys are out of contract at the end of the year. If he decides to do that and Horvat's up and we know Toews is up, it becomes a far more complicated deal than just you need to move a centerman. Yeah. If you got a right-handed D, you're going to be fine. There's never enough of those guys.
That's the way it seems. Always top of list for sure. Alex Ovechkin, right, sits at 797 goals. Gordie Howe, as we know, second overall, all-time scoring in the National Hockey League with 801. So a number of milestones now facing Ovi, right? 800 is a big deal. 3 shy of 800. Obviously, he's going to slide into second place all-time behind Wayne Gretzky at 894. So none of this is surprising. Anybody listening to the Rain Dregs podcast knows these numbers. Here's a number I didn't know. Ovechkin, who scored an empty netter against the Winnipeg Jets on Sunday, that was his 53rd empty net goal of his career. And second only to Gretzky, who finished his career with 56. I was surprised by that number, to be fair, with Ovechkin. Not sure why. It just is he on the ice all the time in the last minute and a half?
Well, obviously he must be, because I would have loved to have had more than 2 or 1 or whatever the hell I had. Like, there's a reason why some guys get no empty net goals.
They're not out
there. You can't shoot it from where you're sitting. And so it's I always remember Brett Hull hated empty net goals. He always talked about it. I'm not scoring when there's no goalie in there. And he wouldn't shoot.
Oh, come on.
I just think that's so hilarious. I don't know how many he's got. It's not very many. And but look, if you're good enough to be on the ice at that time, well, once in a while you're going to get one. 50 of them is amazing. You know what has changed though? That I don't know. Maybe just in the last couple of years. Remember, you'd never shoot at the empty net, or rarely, from your side of center.
You see now, teams are like,
teams are like, if you, and really, when you look at it, it's the correct way to view it. You're an NHL player,
right?
You're one of the best players in the world. If you've got a clean shot at the net from 130 feet, shoot it. Game's over if you hit it, and if you miss it, just win the draw, or now you're going to have to scramble. But I don't mind the chance. I don't like it when it's rushed and under pressure, and it almost seems a little selfish at that point.
Right.
But if you're dead center in your zone, 2 feet inside your blue line, it's not like you're a beer leaguer. You can hit that shot 80% of the time. But 53 of them, geez, man.
Let's cover a couple more things here on the headlines. Mitch Marner hoping to extend his streak. I'm not sure what more we can say about Marner as the streak continues. I like his chances, with all due respect to the Anaheim Ducks, playing back-to-back, coming off
Dregs,
the game against
I wish we had Chris Abbott on here. I wish we had Chris Abbott on here right now from Botano, because this smells like the reverse sure
It does,
thing.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, you're like, every game if I'm not watching the Leaf game, if I'm out somewhere else or I'm watching another game, half an hour into the game, I flip up my app and I'm like, oh yeah, he's got another goal. Oh yeah, he's got an assist or 2 assists. It's like every game you go, it's like I'm just looking in the summary to where he's got his point, because I know it's there. Mm-hmm. I look at Anaheim today and I'm like, well, of course he's going to get a point.
Feels that way. Yeah.
Sometimes the old reverse thingamajiggy, whatever that is, pops up. But it's, again, I mean, there's no way to talk about it other than it's just flat out incredible. He has not missed a point since, I think, October 27th.
I know.
I can't even remember what I was doing October 27th. Probably talking to you, but
probably. Rangers comeback, right? New Jersey Devils on Monday night. Man, what was it? 3-1, and then all of a sudden, here come the mighty Rangers pushing back.
So Dregs really, the Rangers now, they've won 4 straight. So the dogs aren't barking at Gallant's feet so much here. A couple of things happened though over the last 10 days or so. Starting to get a little more production from their young guys. Kako scored last night again. Philip Hedl scored the winner in overtime. He's really, in the last 8 or 10 months, really taken a great step for them. But so they come out of the gate and the Devils just swarm them. It's 2-0 5 minutes into the game in the Garden. You can imagine what that's like there. Not very good. So it gets to 3-1, and Jack Hughes had scored to make it 3-1. Then he gets a penalty shot. And Shesterkin stops him. I mean, it could have been 4-1. It's over. He stops him. The Rangers score. They score off the next faceoff twice in 7 seconds. And it's 3-3. But that was entertaining, man. I don't know when the last time I put the Devils on appointment viewing for myself, but damn, they're fun to watch. They really are.
We were watching at Duffy's Sports Bar here in Palm Beach, and I suggested during the intermission we change over to the New York-New Jersey game, and Billy Garrels hit me with the remote control, so we weren't able to do that.
And you didn't feel that was a point for a stand by you?
No.
Hey, by the way, first, so you saw Billy Guerin. Yeah. You shook hands, right?
Yeah.
How big are his hands?
Like ridiculous.
Okay, so I did the
They're like
game.
hams, right?
Okay,
Like,
yeah, right. Here, so I'm going to throw
he's
another
just a
one up
big
for you
dude.
here.
Yeah.
We get to talk to Craig Berube before the game in St. Louis.
Also large hands.
Oh my God. He grabbed my hand. It was like
Yeah.
I put it in his shoe.
Yeah.
And he's so strong. And I'm like,
Yeah.
no wonder when those guys hit each other, like back in the Chief had 3,000 penalty minutes. Like when they
Cement
fought,
blocks.
like those were enormous humans fighting. And I was like, I felt like a little kid shaking hands with an adult. I'm like,
it's like old
holy
farmer strength, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
pitching bales all the time. You go to shake your hand, they're being nice and they're crushing your hand in the process. Let's wrap up. I just want a thought on acknowledgement of, 30 years ago. So as I said, I'm here at the Breakers for the Board of Governors meeting. The Breakers in Palm Beach is where Gary Bettman was hired as the NHL's first commissioner. Keep in mind, there were presidents before that. First commissioner of the National Hockey League 30 years ago. So when you think of the legacy of Bettman, and he's quickly approaching the status of being the longest tenured commissioner, right? I think David Stern made it 30 years. So February will be 30 years for Bettman. So what do you think of, because you'll have a unique perspective as a player, now somebody who stays educated on everything that goes into the game. Obviously the rule changes because you're there front row center to call the games. So when you think of Bettman and his legacy, is it expansions and the money made? Is it the salary cap implementation? The competitive balance, which we talked about earlier, those rule changes, player safety, rights fees, $6 billion almost in annual revenues. I mean, it's hard to come up with one thing that speaks to what Bettman has meant to the NHL and to the players to some degree for the past 30 years.
Okay, I'll say this. When he came in, of course, we didn't know, and it's a far different world at the time, right? So it's here's a guy from the NBA. We knew him as he was a young guy. He was 40 at the time.
Yeah.
And we knew he was kind of high up somewhere in the NBA, but there wasn't a lot of information to us, to the players, right? He was, of course, the owner's hire.
Yeah.
We were more concerned with finally our Players Association was a coherent group, and because it was headed by Bob Goodnow. Bob had taken over just a few years prior. And so whatever Gary Bettman was going to be, I think the general thought was we were well looked after with Bob. For the first time, it felt like there was somebody that was going to stand up for our rights. Well, shortly after Bettman took over, we went on strike for 10 days right before the 92 playoffs. And if we had any indication of what was coming down the pike, shortly thereafter, there was the first lockout. And so when I think of Gary's legacy,
Mm-hmm.
I think of business, I think of growth, I think of potential growth that's still there. I think there is, he's got the view, I think publicly, as a really cold businessman. And he is. I mean, that's his job. But he's done what he was supposed to do. For 30 years, this game has grown from a $400 million a year business to billions.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is under his stewardship. And you can not like the way he does a few things, and you can not like that the game's been shut down, and I don't like that. And from a player perspective, there are times I'm just furious with the tact that he takes, because he's at the front of it. It doesn't matter what's going on behind him. He's the only guy I see. And so from the player's perspective, there were some rough, rocky times with the perception of Gary Bettman. But I will say this, he cares about the sport. He cares that the sport grows. I think has embraced a lot. It took a long time, but the NHL's embraced a little bit more of the new media. And at 70 years old, I think he gets it way more than people give him credit for. That's my view. He is undoubtedly been good for the league.
Those are your headlines. Once again, thank you to our good friends at Boston Pizza.